And before I start with the presidential address proper, I would like to make a personal remark. And this also explains the reason why I'm talking about this particular topic, because as Ashley has said, my own research is more directed towards macroeconomics and quantitative economic policy in particular. And this is very far from Austrian economics in the sense which I will explain you in a few minutes. But now this year we have the 40th anniversary of this society, of the International Atlantic Economic Society, and the first meeting of this society was in Europe was in 1979, and it was in Vienna. And this was the first acquaintance I got with the society. So I still remember the excitement when I had the possibility to have a presentation among well-known international American economists. And from that time also dates my acquaintance with John Virgo, who was the founding father of this society. He founded it, as you know, in '73, so we have this 40th anniversary. And already in Vienna I got known to him, and later on I developed a relationship of friendship, I would say, and mutual respect. And I was very much impressed by the way he ran the society and did a lot of bringing people together from not at the beginning from both sides of the Atlantic, but now probably globally. So it is very sad that he's no longer with us. He died last year in November, and it would have been very nice if he had been able to be with us in this session. So to some extent I dedicate this address to his memory, and I think this idea of bringing people from Europe and from the United States together, and later on from other parts of the world is at that time it was not as easy as today, because in 1977, 78, 79, it was much more difficult to transcend, to go out of your own cultural circles and to go to an international conference. So I think he was really a pioneer in doing this. So this some words about John Virgo. I also wrote a short piece of memory in the International Advances of Economic Research about him. So what I'm going to present today is something about the Austrian School of Economics, and I will introduce the presentation by presenting the persons of the drama, who are the most important Austrian economists, or have been the most important economists, and then I will say something about Karl Menger, who was the founder of this school and is important for the topic I want to concentrate today, namely these unintended consequences of purposive action. And then in the third part of the presentation I will briefly explain what these unintended consequences are and give a few references to other people who have written on this topic. And then I will say something about the contribution of Karl Menger. And in modern terminology, this would mean I will present a brief account of a case study of an example, what is meant by this, and this is Menger's famous account of theory of the origin of money as a medium of exchange. And finally, I would like to make some personal remarks on why this may be of interest today. Also, the presentation is more or less a topic in the history of economic thought. I think this is should be also of interest at the beginning of the 21st century. So let's start with some remarks on the Austrians. And to say Austrian means, of course, because we are going back to the 19th century, the mid of the 19th century. It means at that time Austria, which is a small state in Central Europe nowadays, was part of a big empire, of the second largest empire of Europe, namely the Habsburg monarchy, which comprised not only Austria but also Hungary and what is now the Czech and the Slovak Republic, Slovenia, Croatia, and a lot of parts of other countries, of Poland, of the Ukraine even, of Romania, and other countries. Bosnia-Herzegovina was enacted by the Habsburg monarchy, so this was a big empire, and its cultural center was Vienna. And even so, in the middle of the 19th century, there was no active research in economics proper. So there was just one person who came in and opened up the Austrian School of Economics, which was Karl Menger. And Menger, I will say a few words later on about him. He was mostly influenced, of course, because it was German-speaking, influenced by the German School of Economics, which was a historical school, the elder German historical school. But nevertheless, he engaged in a severe battle with the younger historical school, so he incorporated some of the tradition of Anglo-Saxon, especially British, Scottish to be more precise, economic thinking. Only 11 years younger was the second generation of the Austrians. The most important and well-known names are Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk and Friedrich von Wieser. Both were only to a small extent direct pupils of Menger, and that was a small world at this day. They were brothers-in-law and both became professors of economics in Vienna. And the second and third generation, the most important name or the most well-known name is Ludwig von Mises, and also Joseph Schumpeter belongs to this generation. Also, he was not in the core of the Austrians. And the fourth generation was the last one which grew up in Austria. The most important names are Friedrich August von Hayek, Gottfried Haberler, Oskar Morgenstern, and Fritz Machlup. Both Haberler and Machlup made it to the presidency of the International Economic Association and of the American Economic Association. Both have been in the United States, Haberler at Harvard and Machlup at Princeton. And then there are the contemporary Austrians who are mostly not in Austria nowadays. So let me show a gallery of these people. This was Karl Menger, the father of the Austrian school, and he is famous, sufficiently famous to make it up to a plaque in the yard of the University of Vienna, which says this is Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian School of Economics. And Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, he was not only important because he was a theorist of capital theory, but he even made it up to the last banknote, to the last shilling note before Austria joined the euro. Here you can see the picture, but unfortunately the people from the central bank told us he was not taken because of his scientific work, but because he had such a beautiful beard, so that the picture would be nice and to be on this 100 shilling note. So, and 100 shilling is not the highest one, but even if you think that Sigmund Freud came only up to 50 shillings, so this is not so bad for Böhm-Bawerk. Böhm-Bawerk was interesting because he was 3 times Minister of Finance of the Habsburg monarchy, and as such he introduced the progressive tax into the tax system at incredibly low rates seen from the present time. But he also made it to the presidency of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, so he was recognized as a scientist, and his capital theory is still debated by some specialists in this field. As you can see, next year he will have the 100th year of his death. He died relatively young. The third second of the second generation, the third of these founders, was Friedrich von Wieser. Friedrich von Wieser was also professor of economics. He succeeded Menger on his chair, and he was also Minister of Trade, and the last Minister of Trade in the Habsburg monarchy from 1917 to 1918. So he again has a plaque in the yard of the University of Vienna. The second generation people, most well-known internationally now, is Ludwig von Mises. As you can see from the dates of his life, he was approximately of the same age as Keynes. Keynes was born 2 years later, and Mises was at the time when he stayed in Austria and in Vienna, he was never made professor in Vienna, and this had something to do with the anti-Semitism which was prevalent in Vienna at that time, not so much during the Habsburg monarchy, but in particular in the interwar period. Mises' family was Jewish not according to religion, but according to this stupid racist ideology which prevailed at that time. And so he was secretary of the Chamber of Commerce, Chamber of Trade, as it was called. But in Austria, he never made it to a professorship, and he had to emigrate. And he went to Geneva already in the 1930s, and in 1940, I think it was, he went to the United States and was visiting professor at New York State, NYU, New York University, and had to teach nearly until his 90th birthday because otherwise he couldn't get a living. And the interesting thing is that after his death, he was a founder of a school of Austrians here in the United States. Well, Mises was a man of letters, as you can see. He owned a large library, and he had an intellectual group around him in Vienna already. He was much more isolated in the United States, but his long-term effects on economists was much stronger here in the United States. Nearly at the same time, born in the same year as Karl Marx died and Keynes was born, Josef Adolf Schumpeter was born. He was one of the two Austrians who in the interwar period became professors at Harvard University, besides Gottfried von Haberler. And Schumpeter belongs only to so to say, to the hardcore, if I want to paraphrase a notion of the philosophy of science from Imre Lakatos, to the hardcore of Austrian economists, because he developed a special long-term economic theory which has become very fashionable, and lots of people are interested in this nowadays. The theory of economic development, a book which in German he finished in 1911 at a very young age, and this was already his second book. The first one is the book in which he created the notion, among others, the notion of methodological individualism, which is a book of 500 pages or so, which he wrote at the age of, I think, 23 or 24 years. So Schumpeter was some kind of a wunderkind and did a lot of very interesting things. And of course, nearly everybody will know his history of economic analysis, which, by the way, was not finished during his lifetime. It was left as a torso, but edited by his third wife after his death. The last generation which was active in Austria comprised Friedrich August von Hayek, and he was a direct descendant intellectually of Mises, and he was very active and a little bit aggressive also, because he was a political philosopher and philosopher of law, and especially later on he took part from economics and concentrated on the philosophy of liberty, which he developed. And he lived long enough, as you can see from this date. He grew rather old, just to be old enough to live until he received the Nobel Prize in Economics, which was introduced in 1969, and Hayek got it in 1974, together with Gunnar Myrdal, which both of them did not like very much the company of the respective other ones, because Myrdal was a leftist socialist and Hayek was a rightist liberal. So this was Hayek. And I also should mention the important name of Oskar Morgenstern. He was also a Privatdozent, which is kind of associate professor at the University of Vienna until 1938, when the Nazis, Nazi Germany occupied or annexed, it's not very clear what it is, Austria at that time. As Mises, he did not return. At the time he was in Princeton for a sabbatical. He did not return to Vienna, in spite of his name, which the stupid Nazi ideologists thought he was Jewish. He was not Jewish. His mother instead was an illegitimate daughter of the German Emperor Friedrich III. So he was very German, but he disliked the Nazi so much that he did not return to Vienna and came to Princeton, which was a great thing for economics, because at Princeton he met John von Neumann, the ingenious mathematician, and they together created the theory of games, which is perhaps, some people would say it's perhaps the only, but certainly it's the most important innovation in mathematics in the social sciences. It's perhaps the only innovation in the social sciences, which mathematical innovation, which was specifically made with a goal of modeling social phenomena. So here you have these two people, and because mathematics is nowadays a basis, a foundation for economics, Oskar Morgenstern is very well recognized. He even made it to a square in Vienna, Oskar Morgensternplatz, which is the address of the Department of Economics and the Department of Mathematics of the University of Vienna nowadays. And the new building, renovated building, which was previously an insurance company's building. And there is an Oskar Morgenstern Award, which will be given by the Department of Economics Tuesday next week. The first award of this will be given to famous game theorist Roger Myerson, Nobel laureate several years ago. So Oskar Morgenstern is also very close to the Austrian school. Also, he departed in one important aspect from the Austrian school, that he took side with mathematics, which was not the case in the Austrian school. So a few of the contemporary Austrian economics, and as I said, the most there was a migration of this tradition, which is the title of a book by Karen Vaughan. He has done a very good scholarly work on describing the ideas and the development of Austrian economics. This was the emigration in the 1930s, both before and especially when Hitler Germany annexed Austria, and it flowered in the USA. Scientific work by Mises, Hayek was well accepted. Hayek was professor at the Department of Economics in Chicago for some time. There was Murray Rothbard, Leland Yeager, Israel Kirshner, Don Lavoie, Peter Böttke, Larry White, Mark Rizzo, Steve Hurwitz, Ed Stringham, and many others who are, most of them are still active. And there's some political influence on the libertarian ideology. The Liberty Fund is one of the institutions which is still carrying on the tradition of Austrian economics, and there's a Mises Institute in Auburn, and people like Ron Paul, who was, as you know, the candidate here for the presidency. I think last year was it, yeah. And there's also some influence on the Tea Party movement. I should say that you needn't be attached to this rather right-wing political ideology to think of Austrian economics, so you can separate it also from this, but certainly this made it influential, and Mises was, of course, a very, as one of his opponents, Oskar Lange, socialist or communist in Poland, said one of the most stubborn economists, stubborn defender of free markets. And there are also other names outside of the United States. Ludwig Lachmann, Lionel Robbins can be called upon this, or there are other names. Now let me return to Karl Menger. Just a few words about his biography. Menger was born in Neusandetz or Novi Sad, which is now a part of Poland, but at that time it was part of the Habsburg monarchy. He studied law and economics in Prague, Vienna, and did his PhD in Krakow. All of these cities belonged to the Habsburg monarchy. And in 1871, when he was only 31 years old, he published his main work, Grundsätze der Volkswirtschaftslehre, which was translated into English in 1970 as Principles of Economics. And this book took the title First Part. He never wrote the second part, although he lived until 1921. And this is certainly tragic, because he even retired prematurely to devote all his time to research, but he never made it to continue this book. The second edition was edited by his son, Karl, who was a mathematician, and as a mathematician also contributed much to not only to mathematics proper, but also to mathematical economics. For example, his most famous piece of work is perhaps the one about the St. Petersburg paradox. And the older Menger, Karl Menger Sr., became associate professor at the University of Vienna, and then in 1879 full professor. And this has something to do with his job as a private lecturer to Crown Prince Rudolf, the son of Emperor Franz Joseph, who never became emperor because he committed suicide in 1889. And even Menger befriended himself with the Crown Prince, and there are even some texts which were published anonymously in liberal newspapers in Vienna, which were co-authored, in fact, by the Crown Prince and Menger. So Menger had some influence on what he thought to be the future of the Habsburg monarchy, a much more liberal, open-minded future than the one which was dominating at that time on the court of Franz Joseph, but unfortunately, so this never came to be realized, and perhaps we would have a completely different landscape in Europe if this had happened before. So Menger returned to academia, and in 1883 he published his second larger book, which is primarily on methodology, with this long German title, and first translated as Problems of Economics and Sociology, but more properly Investigations into the Methods of the Social Sciences, translated in 1963, and I will talk a little bit about something from this book here. But this book was also, I think, known in the textbook because it opened up the so-called first Methodenstreit, the methodological debate between Menger on the one hand as somebody who was pleading for economic theory against Gustav Schmoller, the head of the Younger Historical School, German Historical School, who was favoring empirical, if you want, inductive reasoning, historical analysis as the proper subject of economics, which also resulted in a pamphlet of Menger against Schmoller, which has never been translated, and it's not worthwhile translating, but it's quite nice because Schmoller sent it back without opening and said it's just writing to Menger, I never read something like this, but it's so beautiful, so it should not be put into the fire, so I will send it back. Perhaps you can send it to somebody else. So this was a very severe battle between these two, and in the end this resulted in the fact that until mid of the 1920s, it was not possible for an Austrian to obtain a professorship in Germany. Schmoller and his followers always prevented the Austrians from coming in, so they were, so to say, persona non grata at that time. Menger had a lot of influence, mostly outside Germany, of course. In Italy, there are some names, Maffeo Pantaleone, Luigi Cossa, Antonio Graziani, in Holland, Pearson, USA, Patton, Richard Ely also, in England, Alfred Marshall. In the first edition of his Principles, he mentions Menger, France, some other parts of the Habsburg monarchy. And Menger, due to his, mostly due to his written work, attracted a lot of people within the Habsburg monarchy. So the older Austrian school, until the First World War, were about 10 to 20 persons who did academic work, most of them not as professors at the university, but just they were bankers, Auspitz and Lieben, who in the late 1880s produced a very modern tract on price theory and so on. Menger did also work on capital theory, where he said that Böhm-Barwerk, although he belonged to the same school, committed the greatest error ever having seen in capital theory. So there were also different currents in the Austrian school in Austria. The paper on money, on which I will talk a few minutes later, on the currency reform, he was instrumental in introducing, making this reform of the crown, of the Austro-Hungarian crown. So therefore he got the title of Hofrat, which is something we like being a sir, or not a lord, a little bit less, like a baron or a count or so, and became member of the House of Lords of the Herrenhaus. As I said, he retired already at the age of 63, which was early for that time, and died, but without finishing his work. So this was Menger. And Menger, to some extent, can be regarded as a father of neoclassical economics. You know, there are these three schools, the Austrian, the Lausanne school with Walras, and the English school with Jevons, and later then Marshall, Alfred Marshall. And these are the elements which are in Menger, which are neoclassical. This is methodological individualism, which is important for the topic I want to concentrate later on, meaning that you have to explain social phenomena, in particular in economic phenomena, by going back to the individual. So the individual is the one which is acting, and you have to explain social phenomena like markets and prices and things like that by going to the individual actions. Connected to Homo economicus, this is not, this term is not in Menger, but Menger always, in his theoretical work, always insists that economic action has to be rational, and this has been made more explicit and by authors later on. He is really the father of the subjective theory of value, although there is already some predecessor, Heinrich Hermann Gossen in Germany, but Menger was the first to insist that demand is driving, so to say, the economy. The classical authors put much more emphasis on the supply side. Menger was emphasizing the demand side and particularly these subjective valuations of people. Marginalism can be regarded to be due to some extent to Menger, although he did not use mathematics and not use the optimization calculus for describing the behavior of firms and of households, but this idea of marginal utility. To some extent, this notion does not really appear in his book, but the basic idea is there, and therefore also his price theory, especially monopoly and perfect competition, is very much neoclassical. He has also something to say about dynamics and equilibrium, which is non-neoclassical. Also, his theory of money is only partially neoclassical in that he has the same, he doesn't have the notion which comes from Jevons 3 years later, but of the double coincidence of wants. But what he really has is the idea that the money is primarily a medium of exchange, and the reason why it comes into existence. Well, but there are some non-neoclassical elements like dynamics versus equilibrium. He also has a strong position on dynamics, uncertainty, and time. Both of these are important in his work. He does not elaborate on the supply side and the costs. As you know, Marshall always spoke about this pair of scissors, demand and supply. Menger is completely subjective in the sense that the economy is driven by the subjective valuations of the consumers. And it was Wieser who introduced the notion of opportunity cost. This is also something which everybody knows today, but this was due to Wieser, and he turned to the cost side, and this notion of opportunity cost, which is a subjective notion of cost, not this objective ones which is in Ricardo, is of relevance here. And perhaps the most important difference between nowadays Austrian economists and mainstream economists is that Menger did not like mathematics as a method in economics. He said it's only of limited use, if at all, in economics. And I think this is something which one should not follow, because mathematics has contributed a lot to economics, but this was not Menger's view. So most of these ideas were incorporated into the neoclassical mainstream until the 1930s, but nevertheless there is still a current of heterodox economics nowadays, which calls itself Austrian and is Austrian to this extent. Here you can see just a graphical presentation of how the subjective value theory is to be thought of by Menger. He starts from the needs of the individual, and then the individual determines some value to some goods which are first-order goods, and in order to produce these first-order goods you need second-order goods, and so on. So there's a hierarchy of goods, and to some extent this is also connected with the marketability of goods, on which I will come in a few minutes. So now let me go to the topic of the unintended consequences, and there is of course a predecessor, and this is the father of economics, Adam Smith. In the Wealth of Nations you can find this quotation: by preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends not only his own security, he is speaking about the imports, and by directing that interest in such a manner as its produce may be of great value, he intends only his own gain. And he is, in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. This quotation from the Wealth of the Nations is, by the way, one of only three quotations of Smith where he uses the notion of the invisible hand, and there's a big discussion, especially in a book by Emma Rothschild, about Smith's use of this notion, and she says, and probably she's right, she says there are three different notions in the three quotations. So But here, what is meant here, the words in red are my own not abbreviations, my own way of directing your attention to what I think is important. You have the difference between the intentions of the individual, who intends his own gain, and the invisible hand. There is something which leads up to a social result. And please note that he says frequently promotes that of the interest of the society, not always. This is already in Smith. Hayek said Menger is the modern, so to say, counterpart to Smith, but there are other people who did work on this. For example, Robert Merton, a sociologist, very famous American sociologist, in an article in the American Sociological Review entitled "The Unanticipated Consequences of Purposive Social Action," said these consequences of purposive action, which is these unintended consequences, or some of them are unintended, are limited to those elements in the resulting situation which are exclusively the outcome of the action, those elements which would not have occurred in the action if the action had not taken place. And these sum total or concrete consequences may be differentiated into A, consequences to the actors, consequences to other persons, mediated through either the social structure, the culture, and the civilization. So again, you have this idea of, by a sociologist, of tracing back social phenomena to individual actions. Another sociologist from France, Raymond Bourdon, in a book which is entitled "The Unintended Consequences of Human Action" in 1982, he died a few years ago. You find this quotation, what can you do with possible recombinations of the following criteria? Define the number of possible configurations. No participant or some participants or all participants of the society attain their individual objectives, producing at the same time either benefits or problems, or collective benefits and problems, and each of these applying only to some or to all of the participants. So again, actions on the individual level have consequences on the social level, which may be unintended, which may be not foreseen, and perhaps not even not planned by the individual. More recent writer, a PhD thesis by somebody whose name is very difficult, you would perhaps, he's Turkish, you would perhaps know how to pronounce it, Aydinonat or something like this. He gives 6 elements of what unintended consequences are. These are things which have social, collective consequences on the social level. They are not intended by any specific individual. They are mediated through many individuals. Individual intentions are directed at the individual level, but the outcome is collective, and the action of one individual is not sufficient to bring about these consequences, and there's no collective intentionality. And I think these 6 points, all of them are already in Menger. So Menger is really the author who has done most work to make precise this notion of unintended consequences. And this is, you can find it especially in this investigations book by Menger, which I said before, and he distinguishes between so-called pragmatic and organic phenomena. The results of common will, pragmatic phenomena are results of common will, so something which can be, which is sometimes, especially by Hayek, called by design. So if you have an action of legislation or an action of people coming together, or even a dictator who imposes some rules, this is design, this is common will or will of somebody who it's an intended consequence. But Menger says many phenomena, and these are the interesting ones, are organic in the sense that they are unintended results of human efforts aimed at attaining individual goals. This is a formulation which is due to Menger. So this is the topic which he treats in this book. And he is not. He doesn't. He says you should be very suspicious about analogies between natural and social sciences. These are superficial. Natural sciences deal with problems of life, for example, and life is something which is also perhaps unintended, coming out from dead material. But the social sciences have a different job to do. On the other hand, he's also against what I call organicism or holistic explanations. You should not think of the society as something like acting like an individual, acting like, or even like an organism. This should be explained, as he calls it, in terms of exact, and he calls it explicitly, atomistic understanding in social sciences, which means atomistic is the role model of physics, of course. The idea to trace back social phenomena to its atoms, to the individual's actions. And here, and especially to be exact, means to have a theory, a well-formulated theory about this, and not just some kind of what later was called understanding, verstehen, in the methodology of the especially of the German Romanticism. So Menger was explicitly against the historical school of the Germans, and he said he must do theoretical work. And here's a quotation, I think the most important one, and it has been written in italics in the original. He says, we meet a noteworthy, perhaps the most noteworthy problem of the social sciences. How can it be that institutions which serve the common welfare and are extremely significant for its development come into being without a common will, that's the important thing, directed toward establishing them? And as he quotes as examples of such institutions, money, settlements, cities coming about without somebody who says, now I will found a city here, the state, very important to see this, language, law, morals, markets, and as he says, numerous institutions of the economy. So for Menger, these unintended consequences are the central piece of object of research for the social sciences and for economics in particular. And as an example, which I will go only very brief because time is running out, was Menger's analysis on the origin of money. It's, so to say, a hypothetical history of how money was introduced. Menger starts from the idea there was a barter economy. People, when they left the closed household economy and began to exchange goods and services, entered the barter economy, and in the development of this, some goods were gradually accepted by everyone, and also by those who had no need for them. And the reason for this is that you want to overcome this requirement of the double coincidence of wants. You know, it's difficult if you have some cattle and want to get some, let's say, clothes. It would be you would have to find somebody who needs cattle and has clothes and wants to give them up. So this is a difficult thing, and only gradually it turned out that you should have some goods which were, as Menger calls them, marketable or saleable. And so these goods were acquired by this person, and he didn't need it in particular, but he could use it to exchange it for the goods he needed. So only in some cases, Menger says, money was introduced by agreement or legislation, and it was in the individual interest to obtain marketable goods. And most of these marketable goods started to be accepted by most successful individuals. So people saw when there was somebody who did this, use it like a money, then they imitated, so there was some imitation. And this propagation, and as Menger calls it, through practice and custom, so money turned out to be the unplanned outcome of individual efforts. No one of these members of this hypothetical society really planned to introduce money, planned to introduce a medium of exchange, but instead it emerged, so to say, organically, as Menger called it, as a result of these interactions of these individuals. Now, let me close this talk with some thoughts about why can this be of interest today, apart from the historical interest, which might be nice but not perhaps so relevant for nowadays economics problems. Well, one argument is it's a central tenet of later and contemporaneous Austrian economics. And this Austrian economics, as I said, is now a heterodox current in economic theory, but I think it contains a lot of things which are so far relatively unexplored, but are worth exploring. The idea of the spontaneous order, as Hayek calls it, is exactly derived from this notion of this idea of the unintended consequences. And this was of great importance in the so-called socialism debate. And if you are not aware of the fact that what the socialism debate was, then you will perhaps not know that this is one of the big, so to say, successes of the Austrian school. Ludwig von Mises in 1920 predicted that the centrally planned economy of the Soviet Union could not persist forever and would result in a terrible economic crash. And also it took 69 or 70 years to realize this prediction. It was shown to be pretty true, and the collapse of the empire of the Soviet Union and its nowadays even China is more capitalist perhaps than the United States, and even Fidel Castro and his brother diverting themselves from this socialism. So this was obviously something where the Austrians were right, and the main argument was you cannot make it a society by design. You cannot make a society just by saying so now everybody has to consume 2 left shoes or something like this. So this is obviously an idea which is based on these Austrian ideas. And the Austrians also found their followers in the theory of social institutions, and particularly Andrew Schotter from NYU in his book with the same title shows it also using the example of Menger's Origin of Money, but also other ones. Peyton Young, Avner Greif, Doron Acemoglu, and James Robinson are also authors who develop from different perspectives, develop theories of social institutions based on individual actions. So we have a new institutionalism which is based on the some kind of, if you want, micro foundations, which is but it's not the aggregative micro foundation which is common in macroeconomics, but it's some kind which is similar to this idea of unintended consequences. Menger's monetary theory itself inspired some modern literature like Jones against Schotter, simulation study by Marimon McGrattan and Thomas Sargent, empirical investigation of the emergence of money by Duffy and Ox in the American Economic Review. Luo, Gintis, game theoretic authors, and David in Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. So there are lots of authors who try to model this process Menger introduced by using game theory. And here I think the marriage between Austrian economics and game theory is something which should be much stronger and should be much more followed nowadays, and gives a lot of quite interesting insights. And of course, there is the influence of the methodology on other social sciences, especially sociology, which some people call it economic imperialism, but it is just taking into account the idea that you need some theory of the individual to explain social phenomena. And Merton is one of the famous sociologist. James Coleman is another one. So there are several sociologists who, in contrast to the more structure functionalist sociology, base their analysis on individual actions and on consequences of their actions which are not intended by them themselves. So I think this idea of the Austrian economist Karl Menger, which has been elaborated on by some of his followers, could still contribute something to modern days economic problems, and perhaps you can even explain the crisis phenomena which we had during the last years as unintended consequences of quite rational actions of some individuals in banks and in politics. And if so, if you are convinced by this, then we will have done my job. Thank you for your attention.